At 71, I thought I had finally discovered what retirement was supposed to feel like. For nearly 4 years, I had been living in the Philippines, far away from the American life I had known for most of my adult years. My apartment was modest, my routine was simple, and I had slowly built a circle of familiar faces around me. Every morning, I knew where I wanted to have coffee. I knew which little store carried the groceries I liked, which people I could call when I wanted company, and which streets I preferred when I needed to get somewhere. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was a life that belonged to me. Then, almost without warning, something inside me began pulling me back toward America. The feeling started with photographs from my daughter. She would send pictures of birthdays, school activities, family dinners, and ordinary weekends with my grandchildren. Nothing dramatic was happening in those pictures, yet I found myself staring at them longer and longer. I began wondering how many important moments I had already missed, and how many more might pass while I was living on the other side of the world. I started thinking about the simple things I couldn't easily participate in: the Sunday dinners, unexpected visits, school events, and those ordinary afternoons when family members could simply decide to meet without planning an international trip. Eventually, I convinced myself that being physically closer to my family was becoming more important than the comfortable life I had created overseas. There were other reasons I used to justify returning. I missed understanding every conversation around me without concentrating. I missed walking into an American grocery store and immediately knowing what everything was. I missed driving on familiar roads and knowing exactly where I was going. Even the cooler seasons that I had once taken for granted suddenly seemed wonderful. Whenever something frustrated me in the Philippines, I automatically remembered the easiest and most pleasant parts of my old life in America. If traffic was terrible, I imagined quiet roads back home. If the heat became exhausting, I pictured myself drinking coffee on a cool morning. If I felt lonely, I imagined my grandchildren sitting beside me at the dinner table. Without realizing it, I had started comparing the difficult moments of my present life with the happiest memories of my past. By the time I turned 71, I had convinced myself that returning wasn't really a new decision at all. In my mind, I was simply correcting a mistake. I told myself that the Philippines had been an incredible chapter, but perhaps that chapter had reached its natural ending. My grandchildren were growing older, my daughter had her own busy life, and I didn't want to wake up one day and realize I had spent too many of their childhood years watching their lives through a phone screen. So I began making practical plans. I searched for an apartment close enough to my daughter that visiting wouldn't require complicated arrangements. I looked for a reliable used car. I started sorting through my belongings and deciding what would come back with me and what I would leave behind. When I finally told my friends in the Philippines that I was leaving, their reactions were more emotional than I expected. They understood why family mattered to me, but some of them asked whether I was absolutely certain. I told them I was. I remember one friend looking at me quietly before asking when she should expect me to visit again. I smiled and promised that I would return someday. At that moment, I honestly believed I was saying goodbye to a place I had outgrown. I didn't realize that I was also saying goodbye to a daily routine and a community that had become part of my identity. The flight back to America felt surprisingly exciting. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't wondering whether I had made the right choice. I was convinced I had finally found the answer. When I landed, everything felt familiar in a way that was almost comforting. I understood every announcement. I recognized the signs. I knew how the roads worked. Most importantly, my daughter was there waiting for me. When I saw her and we hugged, all of the doubts I might have had disappeared. For the first time in years, I felt physically close to the people I had missed so much. That first evening, surrounded by family, I remember thinking that I had wasted too much time living so far away. For the first few weeks, America seemed determined to prove me right. I bought groceries in stores I remembered from years ago. I drove around simply because I enjoyed being behind the wheel again. I spent time with my grandchildren and listened to their stories without worrying about time zones. I furnished my apartment and slowly began turning it into a home. Every familiar experience felt like evidence that returning had been the correct decision. I even told friends back in the Philippines how wonderful it felt to be home. And I meant it. At that stage, I couldn't imagine that the excitement would eventually fade. Then the boxes were unpacked, the furniture was arranged, and the visits became less frequent. One morning, I woke up and realized I had absolutely nothing planned. It wasn't a holiday. There was no family gathering. Nobody needed me to attend an event. It was simply an ordinary weekday. My daughter was working, my grandchildren had their own schedules, and my friends were busy with their own lives. I suddenly understood something I hadn't considered before. Being close to family and being part of their everyday routine were two different things. They loved me, but they couldn't build their entire schedules around my return. That ordinary day became the first crack in the perfect picture I had created in my mind. I had moved back because I was afraid of missing my family's important moments, but most of life isn't made up of birthdays, holidays, and special occasions. Most of life is made up of ordinary mornings, quiet afternoons, grocery trips, and uneventful Tuesdays. In the Philippines, those ordinary days had somehow become full without me planning them. There was usually someone nearby to talk to, somewhere I could walk, or a familiar face I might encounter during a simple errand. In America, I had the family closeness I wanted, but I was beginning to discover that I had left behind something else without realizing its value. That realization didn't make me hate America, and it didn't make my family responsible for my loneliness. They were living normal lives exactly as they should. The problem was that I had expected my old life to be waiting for me simply because I had returned to the country where I had spent most of my life. But the world had changed. My family had changed. And most importantly, I had changed. I was no longer the woman who had left America years earlier. I had spent almost 4 years creating a completely different rhythm overseas. And now I was discovering that returning home didn't automatically restore the person I used to be. The first few weeks after returning to America were almost exactly what I had imagined. I was busy enough that I didn't have much time to question my decision. My daughter invited me over for dinner, my grandchildren stopped by when their schedules allowed, and I spent hours setting up my apartment. I bought dishes, towels, curtains, and a comfortable chair for the corner near the window. Every little purchase made the place feel more permanent. I wanted to believe that permanence was the same thing as belonging. When I finally finished unpacking the last box, I stood in the middle of the living room and felt proud of what I had created. This was my new beginning, I told myself. I had my own place, my own car, familiar stores nearby, and my family within driving distance. For a while, I didn't think about the Philippines at all. Then an ordinary Tuesday arrived. There was no family celebration, no appointment, and no reason to leave the apartment. My daughter was at work, my grandchildren were busy with school, and the friends I had once known in America had their own responsibilities. I made breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, checked my phone, and watched television for a while. By lunchtime, I realized I hadn't spoken to another person that day. I decided to run errands simply to get outside. I drove to the grocery store, bought things I didn't really need, stopped for coffee, and sat in my car longer than necessary before driving home. Nothing terrible had happened. In fact, everything was perfectly safe and comfortable. Yet I couldn't ignore the strange emptiness I felt. I had spent years imagining how wonderful it would be to live close to my family, but I had never stopped to consider what the other 6 days of the week would actually look like. I began noticing the difference between family closeness and everyday companionship. My daughter loved having me nearby, and I loved being able to see her without getting on an airplane. But she had a job, responsibilities, appointments, and a household of her own. My grandchildren had school, friends, activities, and lives that naturally became more independent as they grew older. None of that was a disappointment. It was simply reality. I had returned expecting proximity to create a daily connection that wasn't possible for anyone to maintain. When a dinner was canceled because of work, I told my daughter it was completely fine. I meant it, but after hanging up the phone, I looked around my apartment and realized how quiet it had become. In the Philippines, I had complained about noise constantly. Now I found myself missing it. The financial side of returning also became more noticeable once the excitement wore off. I had known America would be more expensive, so the bills weren't a surprise. There was rent, car insurance, gasoline, utilities, groceries, and all the little expenses that seem insignificant individually, but become noticeable when they arrive every month. I could afford my life, but I was once again paying closer attention to every purchase. In the Philippines, I had developed a different relationship with money. I still budgeted carefully, but I had more room for small pleasures. Going out for lunch didn't require as much thought. Paying someone to help clean my apartment wasn't a major decision. I could take a short trip occasionally without feeling that I had to justify every dollar. Back in America, I was comfortable, but I had lost some of the financial breathing room that had made retirement feel easier. Another surprise was how much my old social circle had changed. Before leaving America, I had imagined that my friends would still be there waiting for me. But people don't remain frozen in place while we are gone. Some friends had moved closer to their children. Others had become caregivers for spouses or relatives. A few were still nearby, but had developed completely different routines. When I finally met one old friend for lunch, we had a wonderful time, but much of our conversation revolved around memories. We talked about former coworkers, restaurants that no longer existed, and things our children had done years earlier. We still cared about each other, but our daily lives no longer overlapped the way they once had. Driving home afterward, I realized that I hadn't returned to the America I left. I had returned to a newer version of it, and I had to build a place in that version rather than expecting my old life to reappear. Around that time, photographs from the Philippines started appearing on my phone. A friend would send a picture from breakfast. Someone else would share a birthday celebration. Another message showed a group of people sitting together after an afternoon rainstorm. None of these pictures were extraordinary, but they triggered memories I had been trying not to think about. I remembered how easily a simple morning could turn into an afternoon with friends. I remembered walking outside without having to plan an entire activity. I remembered people noticing when I hadn't shown up somewhere. One photograph showed the little restaurant where I used to eat breakfast, and there was an empty chair at the table. I stared at that chair much longer than I expected. It wasn't the chair itself that affected me. It was the realization that I had left behind a place where my absence had once been noticed.